Well, good morning, everyone. I'd ask you to make your way to a seat, and coffee and water are over there, and tea service as well. Thanks to David and Chris, our facilities crew. And Chris is also on the video folks on the machines back there to be able to make this a hybrid gathering. Yeah, I see Sue giving a thumbs up online. So some that are not here in the room can join us. This is what we've come to call Friends Talking. It's an opportunity for us to have a very informal way of getting to know our guest a little bit more and not require him to prepare any kind of formal presentation, but to make it a much more congenial and just delightful discussion. The Reverend Dr. Bradley Hauff serves as the Missioner for Indigenous Ministries of the Episcopal Church. And as such, as he mentioned at the 9 o'clock service, he's on the presiding bishop's staff, which means that he travels quite a bit. You can ask him about where his travels have taken him lately. But he's also served churches in his now 30-year tenure as a priest in churches in Pennsylvania, Florida, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Texas. And as he mentioned, he's enrolled in the Oglala Sioux tribe. And he lives what I thought was Minneapolis, but as he mentioned, it's southeast down there somewhere. If you don't know reference, come to the 11 o'clock service, you'll hear his particular GPS navigation, including that of Seattle. God bless you for that, my friend. He has several degrees. His Master of Divinity is from Seabury Western. He also has a clinical psychology doctorate and a Master of Education, and then his bachelor's degree was from Augustana College in the Dakotas. Dr. Hauff, Brad, friend, we are really delighted to have you here this morning. So thank you.
It's an honor. Thank you. It's absolutely an honor to be here. A privilege. Thanks. I appreciate it.
I have just a couple of questions, then we'll open it up for everyone. But tell us a bit about your scope of work in this role as Missioner for Indigenous Ministries.
Well, the position has changed over the years. It was first created by the Executive Council of the Episcopal Church in the year 1954. That's how long the Office of Indigenous Ministries has been in existence. A lot of Episcopalians don't know that. We were the first and the oldest of the ethnic ministries offices. The first missioner, the name of the office at that, or the title was Secretary for Native American or American Indian Ministries, Secretary for American Indian Ministries. That was Vine Deloria Sr., who was a priest, and he was Lakota. He was the father of Vine Deloria Jr., who wrote a number of works over the years, particularly in the 60s and 70s, theological works and legal works and historical works, such as Custer Died for Your Sins and God is Red. That was Vine Deloria Jr. Vine Deloria Sr. Was a priest, and for a long time, he was very well known among the indigenous people of South Dakota. He was good friends with my parents. And I remember meeting him and being with him a little bit when I was a little boy growing up. He was a big guy, and he had a big booming voice, and he scared the dickens out of me. I remember he would call the house every now and then, and this voice would, I'd pick up the phone like a little boy would do, and hello. And there'd be this voice on the other end. Who is this? He made me cry once. That's well, I'm his successor now. I don't think I've made anybody cry.
I hope not. Yeah.
No, I hope I don't, but I try not to be scary. The position was created to provide support to the indigenous congregations and dioceses of the Episcopal Church with regard to making sure that they are funded as well as the church can do it, and that people are being raised up for ordination, indigenous people. So I oversee all of that process and work with the finance department at the church center and with executive council and sometimes with the Office of General Convention in assessing and responding to the needs of indigenous congregations and clergy. There are 4 dioceses in the Episcopal Church that are considered to be the indigenous dioceses. They used to be called the 4 aided dioceses because they received significant funding from the General Convention budget for every triennium that a budget is developed. They changed that term though, because aided sounded kind of pathetic and pejorative. And so they're now known as the 4 principal dioceses: North and South Dakota and Alaska and Navajo land. Although Navajo land is not technically a diocese, it's an area mission. But those are the regions that receive significant funding from the church. And if they didn't, they really wouldn't be able to operate because those areas have been crippled by poverty for over 150 years. So that's essentially what I do. I host a lot of gatherings for clergy to get together, conferences. Our big annual conference is called Winter Talk, and that's in January, right around MLK weekend. We've had Winter Talk here in the Diocese of Olympia a couple of times since I've been missioner, down at the Emerald Queen Casino in Fife. That's where we've had it here. Our plan was to have it in Green Bay, Wisconsin at the Oneida Reservation in January, but the Church Center instituted another travel ban after the COVID variant was spreading around the country, and so we couldn't travel anywhere. So we had to do it virtually over Zoom. But our plan for 2023 for Winter Talk is to do our plan to have it in Oneida again, Green Bay and Oneida. And I think that's significant because the Oneida were the first tribe that the Episcopal Church established any kind of intentional missionary work with, was the Oneida when they were in New York State. That was before they were relocated to Wisconsin, where they are now. So the Oneida were really the first.
And as part of that, the Winter Talk gathering this year, even though it was virtual, their office also produced this video that I hope many of you had an opportunity to view. It's the link is on the website. If you just go to this current newsletter, you can get it there, and I highly commend it to you. But the reality is the doctrine of discovery is not new. I think I remember General Convention 2006 being an occasion when we had a video there and was trying to raise awareness. But I think the critique is that here 15 years on, almost 20 years on, much of the church has not really come around to that. And so we're still trying to tell the story. And can you help us understand why the doctrine of discovery is so critically important and why we have a responsibility to it as a church that is invested in a colonial history, whether we like it or not?
I do a number of presentations on the doctrine of discovery around the church to both indigenous and non-indigenous gatherings. And every time I ask the question, how many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery? Maybe half of the hands of the people in the room are raised and the others are not. They've never heard of it. And those who've heard of the doctrine of discovery, some of them don't know what it is. So I find that it's really important to provide a little bit of background with regard to that. There is no one document that's called the doctrine of discovery like you have with the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. It's a series of papal decrees that were issued during the 1400s and 1500s and by at least 3 different popes during that time frame. The first one was the Dum Diversas, which was issued in 1452, I believe. And 2 years later, the Romanus Pontifex was issued in 1454, essentially saying that the Christian nations of Europe, in particular, Portugal first and then Spain, were given divine right and the blessing of the Pope to colonize territories in Africa, to take the land and to subjugate the people. So in those 2 documents lay the foundation for African slavery and European colonization of Africa. Then after the the Western Hemisphere was quote unquote discovered by Columbus, there was another decree that was issued in 1493, about a year later, called the Inter Cetera. And that basically said the same thing that was issued to the European nations given charge and the right to colonize Africa could do so in the Western Hemisphere as well, North and South America, as it later became to be known. And then shortly after that, the Treaty of Tordesillas was drawn up, which essentially gave Spain and Portugal rights to all of the Western Hemisphere as it was known at that time, starting in Greenland, going all the way down to Argentina, I believe. Were all given over to Spain and Portugal, the Treaty of Tordesillas. And then about 10 years later, there was another document, this time in England, that was written by the servants of King Henry the Seventh, a patent that was delivered to John Cabot and his sons to go and explore the Western Hemisphere, to seek out lands that didn't belong already to another Christian European nation and claim those lands for England, and to either indoctrinate or drive the indigenous people there out of those territories. So this discovery philosophy started with these papal decrees, started with Rome and then Portugal and Spain, and then to some of the other European nations such as the Netherlands. And then it went to England with this patent. And then it came over to the United States with English settlements being established here. And Thomas Jefferson was aware of the doctrine of discovery and was a big proponent of it, and wanted it to be used, wanted it to be applied in the new United States. Jefferson, of course, was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And if you've read the Declaration of Independence carefully, you'll know that he specifically refers to indigenous people as merciless Indian savages that were to be excluded from the rights, the inalienable rights given over to humankind, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those did not apply to indigenous people. We were the only people that was specifically named and excluded from the Declaration of Independence. So all of those documents rolled into one lay the foundation for colonization and land theft and genocide of indigenous people and enforced assimilation of those indigenous people who were not killed. So that's the doctrine of discovery. And it came out of the church. Yep. It had its origins in the church, the office of the Pope.
Yeah.
So we have a responsibility as Christians to respond to that and what happened and what's happened since, to the fact that colonization continues to affect indigenous people to this day. And we need to acknowledge it. We need to reckon with it. So that's part of what we started in 2009 when the Episcopal Church repudiated the doctrine of discovery. I think virtually all the mainline Protestant denominations have done so as well. I don't believe the Roman Catholic Church has repudiated it, though. It would be nice if they would, since that's where it had its origins, was in the office of the Pope. Pope Francis recently apologized on behalf of the church for the colonization efforts, namely in Canada, and the discovery of unmarked graves at the residential schools there. But I believe the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, could do more, as well as all the other churches. As you mentioned, Father Steve, we repudiated the doctrine of discovery in 2009, which was important, but there's been very little done since. Yeah. Now in 2018, at that General Convention, we passed a resolution calling for the doctrine of discovery to be taught to the church so that the church would know about it and have an understanding of what we need to do as people of the gospel in response. So it wasn't until like 9 years later that some action was finally taken. We're moving with this very, very slowly, but part of me thinks that it should be that way. I don't think that reconciliation is anything to rush into. We've had over 400 years of the destruction of colonization. We need to spend some time with that. We need to learn about that, be aware of it. We need to reckon with it, which is why I prefer, rather than truth and reconciliation, a truth and reconciliation commission, a truth and reckoning commission, which is what the Episcopal Church has created this year, over the past year, a truth and reckoning commission to come to terms with those uncomfortable, unsettling truths about our church and what we have done, rather than to gloss over it and move forward at warp speed to make reconciliation happen, because that would be contrived, that would be forced. And it would serve nothing other than our own agenda as a church to do something like that. So we've got a lot of work to do. First of all, education, and then coming to terms with what happened and how we can respond. That is a entirely other issue, matter for discussion. We have seen some moves toward reparations in the church, mostly with regard to African Americans. I believe Virginia Theological Seminary has started to pay reparations to the descendants of some of the African American laborers that were exploited at that seminary in the 19th century, and that's important to do. But that's just, I think, scratching the surface.
Yeah. You've touched on reconciliation. I wonder if we can go back. In the video, you share the horrifying story of your father as a young child being sent off to school. And I wept at the story of what you described, that he would go down to the gate every night thinking someone would come and get him. And of course, they never did. And why is the horrific travesty of the boarding schools and the approach to removing kids from their culture, why is that so important for the church to own and deal with and address before we can get to reconciliation? How do we own it?
Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't know this. The church worked hand in hand with the federal government in establishing and operating the boarding schools. This goes back to the 1870s, and President Ulysses S. Grant, he instituted what later became known as the peace policy, the Grant Peace Policy, which assigned Christian denominations charge over the Indian agencies that were established by the federal government in the early 19th century, mostly in the Midwest, upper Midwest, and the western part of the United States. I think there were only a couple of Indian agencies on the in the eastern region of the country. And these were agencies which were intended to look after the indigenous people. They were financed by the federal government so they could distribute food. They could provide a number of different kinds of assistance to indigenous people, which was really important and helpful at that time because a lot of indigenous tribes were in danger of starving to death. At that time, they were forced off their land. They didn't know the area where they went to. They didn't know how to live there. They were endangered. So the government did want to help in that situation. The problem is that the Department of the Interior, which managed these Indian agencies, was corrupt. And money was disappearing and being mismanaged. So President Grant finally said, I'm giving this to the churches. So every Christian denomination had charge of at least one Indian agency somewhere in the country. And the Episcopal Church had charge of most of them in the upper Midwest and parts of the West, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wyoming, those areas. And that's where the boarding schools got started. Now, there were two different kinds of boarding schools, those that were operated by the federal government, and that was the largest number of them, and those that were operated by churches. The Episcopal Church, the thing about it is, this happened such a long time ago. Most of the Episcopal boarding schools were closed by the year 1917 due to lack of funds. The federal government cut off funding to sectarian schools of all kinds at that time. So the churches had to raise their own money to operate these schools. And the Episcopal Church just wasn't able to do that for the most part. So virtually all of our denominations, Indian boarding schools, closed before 1920. And a lot of records, if they were adequately kept at all, have disappeared. Those who attended those schools have either died or they're very elderly right now. So there's a lot that we don't know. I know of 7 Indigenous boarding schools that the Episcopal Church operated. There might be more. I don't know. That's how much we need to come to terms with this and investigate and learn.
Thank you for that. I'm going to step down and invite anyone who wants to ask a question of Dr. Hauff to please let me know, and I'll come to you with a microphone. And if you would stand and maybe introduce yourself to Dr. Hauff and then your question.
Dr. Hoffman, good morning. Is it Dr. Hauff?
Morning.
Dr. Hauff, good morning. My question is, you said the need to reckon with it. It seems that that's really important. Like right now, it seems to me, my observation societally is that there's a need to forgive and rush to forgiveness because it's so uncomfortable. So uncomfortable to be where we are right now, to hurt.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there is value in being stuck and then just knowing what that feels like. And then there's a moment, or maybe there's a process there's a pre-processed reconciliation, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly not anything we want to rush into. And we want to make sure that we've asked forgiveness for all of our sins. And then we're at the point now where I don't know if we're aware of what all of our sins have been. So it wouldn't be genuine if we tried to make it happen as soon as possible. And this is a two-way street. This involves the indigenous tribes as well. And they are the offended party. They need to play a role in this process. It can't be unilateral. There are a number of churches, there are a number of indigenous people right now who want nothing to do with the church, want nothing to do with Christianity because of its work in the colonization process, and that's entirely understandable. We have to find a way to communicate with these folks, reach out to them, and demonstrate to them that we're serious, we're contrite, we want to do the right thing, even though we might not know what the right thing is in detail. But we want to acknowledge what we did and lament it and work for reconciliation. I actually see it more as conciliation, because reconciliation assumes that there was a relationship to begin with. And there really wasn't in the case of a number of tribes anyway. But we do need to start thinking about it. We can't just be silent and forget about it. You know, we need to move forward eventually in some way, and we want to do it in the right way.
I'm Roger Lee, Dr. Hauff, and a cousin of mine is married an attorney who's the attorney for the tribe, and they live in Shawano, Wisconsin, where I believe the reservation is located. So I was wondering if the meeting that you were talking about having in that area was going to be focused on that particular reservation. And also, what can you tell us about that reservation as it relates to the events that you've just described to us?
Yeah, the Oneida Reservation, which is in the town of Oneida, it's near Green Bay, where they have been since the 1820s, since they were removed from New York. There are some of them that did remain in New York and some that went up into Canada. There is a church there on the Oneida Reservation called Holy Apostles Episcopal Church, which has been there since the mid-19th century. It's a very formidable congregation. I think one of our largest and strongest indigenous congregations in the Episcopal Church. And they have raised up indigenous leadership there. Their current vicar is white, but they've had a series of indigenous clergy that have served there. Very strong and historic congregation. And they did something that was really remarkable in the last couple of years. They participated in the successful repatriation of the remains of 3 Oneida children who died while they were living at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. They had been buried in the Indian cemetery there. They weren't allowed to go home for a burial with their tribal people. They had to be buried there at the school. There are efforts now to repatriate those remains back to tribal lands. And Holy Apostles Oneida helped the Oneida tribe with that process and getting those children brought back to Oneida for burial the way it should be, so that their journey can be complete. The funeral was held at Holy Apostles for those 3 girls. And then 2 of them were buried in the tribal cemetery, and 1 was buried in the church cemetery. Ophelia Paulus was her name. And it was a very, very moving experience. It's a wonderful congregation. Actually, repatriation of the remains of these students, many of which are off reservation lands still, is absolutely a significant thing to do. It must be done, and the church can help with it. That's something that the church can do to make things right moving forward.
Wasn't it the director of the Carlisle School who coined that phrase, kill the Indian, save the man?
Yes, that was Captain Richard Henry Pratt. That was his motto of Carlisle, was kill the Indian in order to save the man, which meant that enforced assimilation of indigenous children into the dominant society of the general American population was their only hope for survival. So get rid of everything about them that's Indian and replace it with American culture and language.
One of the wise people on the video remarked that non-Indigenous people are starting to understand that when they're looking at climate change and the care of creation, that the Indigenous people are teaching us now, or if we would stop and learn. But my question is, has the Episcopal Church, I'm assuming at the beginning, way back when, they did not embrace Indian or Native spirituality. So has that evolved? Is there more, I don't want to use the word integration, but maybe just acknowledgement? Because I think someone on the video also talked about what drew her to Christianity in some ways was that she saw some of the similar symbolism. So history of how the church has evolved, I'm hoping has evolved regarding Native spirituality.
It's really unfortunate that the early missionaries were not at all interested in indigenous spirituality and ceremonies and practices. They saw their task as being that of assimilation and conversion to Christianity, and Christianity as it was known and practiced at that time. If they had only been able to have an appreciation for indigenous spirituality and religion, I think things would have gone very differently. It hasn't been until quite recently that the church has expressed an interest in learning from indigenous spirituality and use of some of that indigenous ceremony in our liturgies. You have to be careful about that as well, though, because indigenous people are very sensitive to being appropriated, having their traditions appropriated by non-indigenous people. So we need to be mindful of that and careful of it. But on the other hand, when the early missionaries came to my family's area of the country up in the Dakotas, and they heard the gospel read to them and preached to them, they picked up on it right away. They understood it immediately because there were so many things about this Jesus that resonated with their own value systems and their own religion, the principles, the teachings. And some of the tribes had Christ-like figures in their stories, their origins of their mythical origin stories. The Lakota people saw that connection so quickly that they concluded that Jesus must have been a Lakota, because only a true Lakota would be so brave. Only a true Lakota would be so generous. Only a true Lakota would go to his death with such honor and dignity. Only a true Lakota would be helpful of people who are in need. He embodied Lakota values and traditions. So they didn't know about the first century Palestinian Jew known as Jesus of Nazareth, the Jewish Messiah. But they knew Christ. And really what the missionary should have done at that point is preach Jesus as the native Messiah, the one who fulfills indigenous values and teachings. Because we have a very difficult time identifying with the Old Testament and the narrative of Israel. We see Israel as colonizers. I mean, who were the indigenous people of the Middle East at that time? It wasn't Israel. It was the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Jebusites and the Hittites, the enemies of Israel who were driven out and slaughtered. We identify with them and not with Israel.
Yeah, one of the reasons that we invited Dr. Hauff to be with us today is outgrowth of the vestry's work on a document that hopefully you're all familiar with, Statement of Lament and Commitment to Action. But I've asked Ken and Rosario Cruz to speak a little bit more about that because it's undergirding all of our restorative justice work.
Thank you, Steve. And Dr. Hauff, thank you for reminding us about the work of approaching this at a holy pace, approaching this work of reconciliation or conciliation, right? As a holy pace. The work that we are doing based on the statement of lament and the commitment of action is about we are engaging into that difficult work of not hurrying things up. It's not in the DNA. It's not in the DNA of our church to move at a pace that is built in relationships, and that is a pace that is about holy and transformative listening, transformative learning, and then what I'll say, humble companionship with people rather than for. So the work that we're doing with the statement of lament and the commitment of action is recognizing our own participation and how that is breaking us and breaking our relationship with others. And then a commitment to do transformation that is not just head, but is also transformation that comes out of a heart and out of the spirit. And we need the companionship. We need the companionship and the wisdom that comes from you to remind us that this is a work that we would do not as a glossy work, but actually something that is transformative, and that there'd be some pain. There'd be some pain and some discomfort around it. So part of the work that we are doing is how do we build capacity to listen to stories, listen to the stories in a way that is not just waiting for you to be done, but actually that the stories that transform us. And from then on, what are we learning? And how is that learning move us to be with and to be in solidarity? And also deal with our own issues. We have to deal with our own issues before we start going out trying to point out fingers.
The challenge in all of this has to do with white privilege. What white privilege says is that if you're white, you don't have to care about any of this. It's of no consequence to you if you don't. And that's something that's hard to get through and get past. I mean, so many people deny that white privilege exists to this day, and they don't want to think about it. But you really have to come to terms with that first. and then come to terms with the gospel as well. So that even though we may be white, if we truly are Christians, people of the gospel, we have to care about this. We have to make this a part of our life's work. Otherwise, we can't call ourselves Christians. So motivating people to do something that they don't have to do is a big challenge. It is.
Well, thank you for that. And mindful that we've put you to work to preach again at the next service. We're going to finish up here, but before we do, I want to offer you a few gifts from this community. One is a lap quilt made by the quilt ministry here. And so I will hand you that to unfurl and let people see. And then we have some cathedral honey from the cathedral honeybees. We call it holy honey here. So, and then as you and I discussed, because you're on the presiding bishop staff, we don't remunerate you for your participation with us. We count that as a blessing, and in honor and gratitude for that, we have made a gift to IndigiAid. So that check will go in the mail tomorrow to them, and we are delighted for that. Will you all greet and give thanks to Dr. Hauff? Thank you. IndigiAid, I'm going to hand that to you. And
Yes, IndigiAid was like a telethon in the summer of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. It was virtual, and we did it in order to raise funds for indigenous communities and congregations throughout the country that were suffering from the effects of the pandemic and in need. So addressing emergency needs. The fund is managed by the Episcopal Diocese of Northern Michigan, so that's where the money goes. Bishop Rayford Ray is a good friend and colleague. And then it's distributed to congregations. I think the most recent help that they gave was to the indigenous congregation in Idaho, Fort Hall, Idaho, Good Shepherd Church on the Shoshone-Bannock Reservation. They needed a new furnace last October with winter coming. And so IndigiAid paid for that. So yes, very good cause. Thank you.
see you upstairs.